Welcome back to Hampton Lake Homestead. In my last video in this series, I gave an outline of how I'd be planting my Three Sisters beds this spring. Today I'm going to get started with planting, starting with the corn. Since I have 3 different beds to plant, I'm going to use 3 different methods of planting in each of the 3 beds to see which works best for me. So let's get started. Before talking about how I'm going to plant the corn, I would first like to spend a minute talking about bed preparation. All 3 of these beds this past fall were planted with 2 cover crops that consisted of crimson clover as well as snow peas. Both were killed off during the frost, but the crimson clover started regrowing this spring. And of course there were weeds in the bed that were growing as well. The first thing that I did was pull up the weeds by hand, and then using a weed eater I cut the crimson clover back right down to the soil level, leaving the roots in place. I had previously obtained a soil sample from Ward Laboratories, and based on those studies' recommendations, I applied micro-life fertilizer at the recommended rate. Once that was done, I put down 2 layers of contractor paper so that they overlapped enough to fill the entire bed. Then I applied 2 inches of mushroom compost on top of the contractor paper, and on top of the compost I applied 6 inches of leaves that I had harvested from my yard during the fall. Now, getting back to the subject of planting corn. Again, I've got 3 different beds that I'm going to be planting, each with 2 rows of corn that will be planted intensively. Traditionally, what I would do in this case is place stakes at either end of the bed and run a measuring tape in between them and plant by hand at 1-foot intervals. Now, because I use Back to Eden and Ruth Stout methods, that means that I first have to remove the mulch that's in place, which in this case is 6 inches of leaves. So traditionally what I would do is just by hand remove enough leaves to plant 1 seed at each 1-foot interval. Obviously this is a laborious and time-consuming process, but it's one that I've traditionally preferred because it leaves the mulch in place, which helps with moisture retention and to inhibit weed growth. This is the method that I will be using in the first bed. Now, to try to save time, in the second bed, I'm going to do something different. This time, I'm going to first rake the leaves completely out of the way so that that's all done at once with a big rake, rather than me having to get down on my hands and knees and doing it one step at a time. Otherwise, I'm still going to place the stakes at either end of the bed, run the measuring tape, and still plant by hand at 1-foot intervals. In the third bed, I'm going to try something that, at least initially, will be even faster. I will still place the stakes on either side of the bed, just as I've done in the first 2 beds, but this time, initially, I will not run the measuring tape. Instead, I'll use an earthway planter and plant the seeds with the planter by just pushing it between the 2 stakes. Now, obviously, this method is going to be much faster, but it's not nearly as accurate. The seeds will not be coming up just at nice, neat 1-foot intervals, but they will be coming up in much thicker intervals than that, typically about 3 or 4 seeds per foot. So what I will do after the plants have grown is I will then run my measuring tape between the 2 stakes, and then I will go along and thin the plants to 1-foot intervals like I want them. Now, obviously doing it this way will not be nearly as accurate, and what I'm mainly just trying to do is get plants that are close to the 1-foot intervals where I want them. This spring, I'm planting a type of corn that is called Hickory King from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. So, let's get to planting some corn. For the first bed, I'll measure over 10 inches from the edge of the bed, and remember that the loop at the end of my measuring tape is 2 inches long, so that extra 2 inches has to be added to any measurement that I make, which is why I'm planting at the 8-inch mark on the tape. Then I do the same at the opposite end of the bed. Then I run the measuring tape between the 2 beds, and on the first row, plant at each 1-foot mark. Then I move over 10.5 inches and run the measuring tape again, and then plant at each 6-inch mark. Again, I'm planting each seed individually, and I remove the leaves immediately around the area of each side, which is a slow and laborious process. Until the corn is 2 to 3 inches tall, I frequently come out and have to remove leaves again and again because they fall back down into the hole that I've made in the mulch. When planting by hand, I place the seed down onto the soil and then push it in with my finger to a depth of 1 to 2 inches. The distance from the tip of my finger to the first knuckle is about 1 inch, and that is how I gauge the depth of each seed. Now, in the second bed, I will basically be doing the same thing that I did in the first bed, only this time I'll be raking the leaves completely out of the way before getting down to plant in the actual bed. With the leaves out of the way, I can get the job done quicker because I remove the leaves with a rake while standing, rather than bending down over the grow bed and removing a few leaves at a time in the immediate area where I'm planting. The disadvantage, though, is that the beds will need more frequent watering, and there is a greater risk of weed growth. I'm going to see if saving time on the front end, meaning at the time of the planting, is worth it in the long run by how much extra work I have to do later by not having the leaves in place over a larger area of the bed. In the third bed, I'll be planting with my earthway planter. The planter is set to plant at a depth of 1 inch. The corn wheel is placed into the hopper, and the hopper is filled with seed. I again place stakes in this bed, just as I did in the first two. But this time I won't be stretching the tape, but will be using my vision to push my earthway planter between the stakes using my vision to keep a straight line. The planter is then slowly pushed down the grow beds between the two stakes. The obvious advantage here is that I don't have to plant by hand, and the planter is far faster. But I'm curious to see how well the corn grows, since I will later have to thin the plants to 1-foot intervals and possibly have to move some plants around within the bed by digging them up first. The wheel tracks left in the beds indicate that I was able to keep a nice straight line. Now, I just need to keep these beds well watered, especially beds 2 and 3, which are mostly uncovered. Well, for today at least, bed 3 was by far the quickest and simplest one that I did. But I'm going to be watching them throughout the rest of this spring and summer to see which one is the easiest to use and, more importantly, which one grows the best crops. So if you haven't already, be sure and subscribe to my channel so that you'll get these videos when I release them. That's all I have for today. Thanks again for watching.